Welcome to this webinar about the urban-rural divide and energy transition policies. We're going to wait a couple of minutes for people to come in. We'll start at about 5 past. So let's just wait for people to join the room. Just to say that if you would like to ask a question, please post it in the Q&A box, and then at the end in the Q&A session, we'll answer the questions that have been listed in the Q&A part of the webinar. Both of the presentations will be available on our website after the presentation, so you can go and download them there. Let's see if we've got any more people coming in. Okay, that we seem to have everybody who wanted to join right now is here. So we're going to have 2 speakers today. We're going to have Benedikt Walker, who is going to do the main presentation, and then Dr. Thina, who's the head of PARI's local government program, will be the respondent. Benedikt Walker is at the University of Bonn, teaches economic geography there. This research presents mostly his PhD research, which is looking at the impact on urban-rural inequality from energy transition policies in Germany. He's now focusing much more on the German hydrogen economy. He is a research associate of the Collaborative Research Center and is involved in the research project Governance of the German Hydrogen Economy and the Globalization of the German Energy Transition. And he's been a student of political science and human geography. So Benedikt, let's hand over to you and you can give us your presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Tracy and Thina, for having me. I'm just going to share my screen with you. And what I want to do with you today is walk you through conflicts that have emerged around the German energy transition. The screen. This is the outline of my talk. I'm just going to delve into the German energy transition and where it stands today, and then go into a particular case where I think I can highlight a couple of the reasons why there's so many unresolved territorial conflicts in Germany around renewable energy projects today. I want to highlight 4 reasons here. On the one hand, the territoriality of planning, here focusing on wind turbines, which are particularly contested in Germany. So looking at who has a say in siting wind turbines, essentially. Then the territoriality of power generation and demand, which already highlights the urban-rural divide between electricity production and consumption. And the territoriality of electricity prices, which is a rather German topic, I would say, but maybe also valuable to know for a South African audience. And then one of the main reasons, I think, for conflicts around energy projects in general, that's the territoriality of energy value chains and essentially where do profits realize. And then last, alternative development models, which might conflict with renewable energy projects. And last, I will draw some conclusions and here also speak about how these conflicts in Germany relate to South Africa, because there's some direct links that I want to highlight, and maybe we can explore those in discussion later. The research I draw from here was published in a paper. If you want to read up on it, I just put it on the screen now. So you don't have to listen to my talk and my German accent if you read it. This is a much more detailed account of what I'm going to talk about in the next few minutes. So the German energy transition has the goal to reach carbon neutrality by 2045. That's a legal goal that the state has defined itself. And already by 2030, 80% of electricity should come from renewable energy sources, which is a highly ambitious target given where we stand today in Germany. Progress in the electricity sector itself is, compared to the other energy end-use sectors like heating and cooling and transport, relatively good, but has also stagnated in the last years. If you look at the last years here, roughly between 2018 and today, there's not much progress being made. And so one of the reasons why there's not so much progress in regard to increasing the share of renewable electricity in the power grid is that there are a lot of conflicts around renewable energy projects across the entire country. As a background for these conflicts, we must consider the governance structure of Germany. Germany is a federal state. You see here 16 federated states that comprise the entire country. And I want to focus on one particular region or federated state here, which is the federated state of Brandenburg. It surrounds the capital city of Berlin. This federated state is comprised of 5 regions, all around Berlin. And in one of those regions, the region to the northeast called Uckermark-Barnim, there are 3 municipalities in which conflict around renewable energy projects, particularly wind parks, erupted that increased considerable tensions at the federated state level and the national level as well. So it had a quite big impact on renewable energy planning at the federated state and national level. And that's why I want to look at this particular conflict in more detail in the following. So in 2018, when wind parks were developed in these 3 municipalities, citizens started to protest. You see a picture of protests here on the left. And this culminated in the mayors of these 3 municipalities, which you see at the right, signing a declaration with several demands addressed to the federated state and the national government. Those demands were, in short, the 4 that I put on the screen below. So on the one hand, no wind turbines should be sited closer than 1,500 meters to houses. No wind turbines should be located in forests. The municipalities should participate economically in wind park developments, and their landscapes should be protected from undesirable effects, basically regarding the visibility of wind turbines. And if you explore the reasons behind this declaration in more detail, I think 4 reasons are particularly important. The first is the municipalities really have no direct say in the planning of wind parks in Germany. They have at least no veto power. The way wind energy planning is done in Germany is as follows. The higher political levels, that's the national government, the federated states, and the regions, which you see here on the left again, they define exclusion criteria. So essentially defining areas where no wind turbines should be located. That includes nature reserves, that includes distances to houses. In some regions, that includes forests. Then you have technical reasons like airports and others where no wind turbines can be located due to security issues, and the range of other criteria. And if you map those criteria onto the region on which I want to focus here, this region in the northeast, Uckermark-Barnim, then you see that there's not much space left for wind turbines. So the wind turbines, the suitable areas for wind turbines are marked in these black fragmented areas. and it's only a very small share of the entire territory of the region. Some of the suitable areas were located in the south, where these 3 municipalities are. And so wind turbine construction could start there without actually taking the political opinion of these 3 municipalities into account. A second reason for the conflict was that the municipalities felt that they were essentially producing energy for the city of Berlin, which is close by, and which is also true. The problem is that renewables, at least if they should mass produce renewable electricity, are usually located in rural areas. They need a lot of space. And so rural areas in Germany, as in any other country, will produce the majority share of renewable electricity in the future, essentially serving cities. You see here on the left, the red areas are essentially the rural areas with relatively low share of inhabitants compared to electricity capacity. While you see some of the bigger cities, such as Berlin in yellow, where you have a lot of inhabitants, but a relatively low share of electricity production. And so the question then is, who should essentially benefit from this relation of production in rural areas and consumption in urban areas? Related to this is a problem that is to some extent a particular German problem. The way that electricity prices in Germany are structured is that the consumers pay a grid levy, and depending on the costs that are created to connect renewable electricity sources to the grid levies can be higher or lower. Now, the problem is that wherever there's a lot of renewable electricity sources being added to the grid levies tend to increase. So actually, where a lot of renewable electricity is being produced, the grid levies tend to be the highest, which you see, for example, if you compare this northeastern part of Germany to the map on the left side, you see that wherever there's a lot of renewable electricity consumption, production, the grid levies also tend to be highest. So, for example, in our 3 municipalities, the electricity prices then were considerably higher than in the city of Berlin, even though they produced the electricity for Berlin, and that was conceived as an unfair disadvantage. A third reason for the conflict was that the municipalities felt they didn't profit economically from wind turbine developments. You see an example of the wind energy value chain here. Usually there's a share of somewhat around 70% of the total investment costs that are CapEx. So that's capital expenditure costs, and 30% that is operational costs. And if you look at what percentage of these total costs is then being invested in a certain territory, you will find that often a high percentage of these total costs is basically invested in cities where you have, for example, banks and other institutions that finance renewable energy sources or that develop them. And only a relatively low share is being invested in municipalities where the wind or other renewable energy sources are actually located. So, for example, if you look at who does the planning of renewable energy sources, then those planners are often located in central cities where they can easily reach different areas to plan renewable energy sources. So in my example, for example, the planners were located in Berlin, again, reproducing this unevenness of who benefits and who has at least felt disadvantages of renewable energy planning. The financing was also done by a bank that was based in Berlin. So again, the profits realized there in Berlin rather than in the rural municipalities around Berlin. Manufacturing in Germany is not really happening so much anymore, but again, there was no local manufacturing site, so the profits essentially were realized elsewhere. Construction is often done, at least to a certain extent, locally, so building firms can often at least partly profit from renewable energy developments locally. Maintenance and operation, in my case, was done by the planning firms that were again based in Berlin. And then the deconstruction is related to construction, often also done locally again, but only constitutes a small share of the total investment costs. So it's not really a huge economic benefit. And then recycling or landfill are sometimes done nationally, locally. But again, there's not much value added here. So essentially, a lot of the high value added activities were not realized locally in the municipalities, so they felt left out. The disadvantages were felt locally, but the advantages, the economic profits essentially realized in other territories, particularly in close by Berlin. And so this was a perceived unfairness. And then last, these 3 municipalities had alternative development models that they felt were endangered by renewable energy developments. They particularly specialized in housing provision for commuters. So they kind of try to valorize their landscape, which is essentially an agricultural landscape. You can see it here on the right. As an attractive living environment for commuters that would then live in these rather rural municipalities close to nature with a lot of recreational activities and commute to Berlin. And developing housing basically would provide much more taxes to the municipalities, for example, income taxes and so on, than the development of wind turbines. And since housing cannot be developed close to wind turbines, there's this rule that the distance should be at least 800 meters. The municipalities fear that if future wind parks would be developed, they could essentially not grow their municipalities anymore and develop housing. Just to wrap up and also reflect on what the consequences of these conflicts are at an aggregated level. So Germany has really suffered from these conflicts in the way that, as I said, no additional capacity was added, particularly not wind capacity for several years, which has motivated a lot of German renewable energy developers to diversify their business in terms of going abroad and diversifying against this risk that conflicts in particular locations might stop renewable energy developments. So, for example, one of the renewable energy developers in this region that I was talking about is called Enatrag, which is very active in South Africa at the moment. Other renewable energy developers also went abroad as a result of this missing expansion of renewable energy sources in Germany. And then second, the German national government is increasingly looking into renewable energy imports in the form of hydrogen and other derivatives, also, for example, from South Africa, in order to compensate for the missing renewable energy capacity in Germany. And then maybe on a slightly more proactive note, I think there are a couple of solutions that were developed as a result of conflicts like the one I described in Germany, and that could maybe also be discussed in other countries such as South Africa. I think what's really essential is that there should be a fair distribution of renewable energy sources across municipalities. There's a couple of research groups in Germany now who are trying to develop models of how to distribute renewable energy sources across, for example, urban and rural areas. having in mind that the conditions for developing renewable energy sources in these different types of territories is very different. The Federated State of Brandenburg has introduced a special tax for renewable energy developers in Brandenburg. So they have to now pay 10,000 euros per wind turbine and year to a municipality that hosts a wind turbine in order to mitigate this problem that the profits would not necessarily realize where the wind turbines would be built. There's still a discussion around what might be a reasonable price. 10,000 euros, a lot of people argue, is too little to, for example, make up for other developments like the development of housing. But I feel it's a start, and it's an opportunity at least to discuss how to mitigate these benefits and burdens. And last, I think the local population should pay lower electricity and grid prices. This is again a discussion that is currently under development in Germany, but there's not really solutions to it yet. Even though some renewable energy developers are acting proactively on this issue now and are offering special tariffs to the local population. So essentially reduced fares and tariffs on renewable electricity, which then can increase the local support for renewable energy sources. And that's my short presentation. Thank you for listening. If you have any feedback, I'm happy to be emailed. I'd be particularly interested in knowing how you perceive German project developers in South Africa. If you have any experience regarding this question, how do they behave essentially in South Africa? I'd be happy to engage further, and I'm looking forward to the discussion now. Thank you.
Thanks, Benedikt. That was really, really, really interesting. And I think your question about how German developers are behaving in South Africa, I think we're going to get the opportunity to see that firsthand, because certainly in Mpumalanga and the coal mining areas, there are a lot of GIZ and other German organizations that are very involved in developing things here. I think let's not take questions now. I think let's move on to Thina's response, and then we'll take questions. Once again, if you want to ask a question, please post it in the Q&A. And then just for the one question that is in the Q&A, we will have all of both of the presentations will be available on our website. We've posted a link in the chat box to where you can download those presentations. But I think let's hand over to Thina now to present, and then after that we can get into a discussion. But thanks again, Benedikt. Thina?
All right, okay. Thank you very much, Benedikt, for sharing that presentation. In fact, it's one of the most critical presentations that I've come across, because obviously I had an opportunity to engage with you and read your paper, and I found your paper to really draw quite a lot of parallels to the South African case. You've also read the report that I produced in 2021 on Whose Power Is It Anyway, which talks about our experiences in South Africa in the local government sector with the Renewable Energy Independent Power Producers Program that was started a couple of years ago. And just for the benefit of our audience, even though I'm responding, but there are some people in the room who might have not read the report. It's available on the PARI's website. But I just thought, let me just put in a summary just to respond to some of the experiences that we're getting from Germany. And I thought I would just start with this quote, which shows the kinds of implications that the IPP, in short, we call it the IPP, the Independent Power Producer Program in South Africa, the implications that it has had on local government development. And these were some of the concerns that were relayed by a mayor of a municipality called Mthanjeni Municipality, which currently hosts the wind and solar renewables. And this is related to the whole concerns around the way in which the municipality 10 to 12 years later has found itself in a direct constraint where they've accumulated an Eskom bill and they aren't able to meet that debt, and yet communities are beginning to complain about why aren't the IPPs contributing towards providing them with affordable electricity, as electricity is becoming more expensive. But just to give a brief background, as you know, in South Africa, we've had a problem with the energy crisis. And obviously, South Africa also had committed itself towards moving into a direction of a clean carbon economy. And the REIPP program was then introduced to supplement the grid shortfall that Eskom was experiencing with the load shedding by taking up cleaner forms of energy generation. And currently in South Africa, we have 112 wind and solar projects, which are distributed throughout the provinces, which are the Northern Cape, Western Cape, and Eastern Cape, and some parts of the Free State and the Northwest. And recently in 2021 and 2022, we have more projects that have come on board, which are 12 and 13 solar and wind projects. And there are also 6 additional projects that came in last year in the bid window 6. Now, in South Africa, the REIPP program is used as a policy instrument to bolster, the green economy, and as a way of re-engineering our economy into the carbon neutral economy. And on the other hand, we see that when we talk about IPPs in South Africa, we only look at it within the framework of its economic development, contributions towards a renewed economy, supplying the grid, etc. But we don't understand what happens during the process of development. I mean, what kind of impact it has on infrastructure planning and socioeconomic development of rural host municipalities, and particularly underfunded and less developed municipalities in South Africa, who have really limited resources and institutional capacity to leverage these new forms of economic development. So this is the kind of spatial layout of the IPP sector. As you can see in the Northern Cape, it has the majority of IPPs. And currently, like I said, we're taking up on more IPPs, and there are some that are going to be taken upon in the Northern Cape and Eastern Cape and Western Cape province. So right now, the Northern Cape hosts 59 out of these 112 projects. And yet we really don't engage with this whole debate about the energy infrastructure, energy poverty, and energy distribution from the lens of looking at it within the center and the periphery. So we often look at it from the urban city and, just neglecting, to create these linkages between the periphery and the centers. And for me, when I read your paper, Benedikt, you spoke a lot about, geographical territories, the political geography, and institutional, spatial planning. And for me, you position it within the regional and the urban disproportions of energy distribution. But in South Africa, I use the term as margins of the state to conceptualize this paper, because the Northern Cape, which is the highest producing green energy in South Africa, is characterized, as being part of a marginal geographic positioning in the rural economy. It's characterized by scattered settlements. It has low population densities. It's got a whole lot of, dynamics around the economy, because those economies are mostly extractive in their nature. It's the mining sector, it's the agricultural sector. And from an African perspective, when we talk about rural margins, they are always characterized by deprivation, under-resourcement, and underdevelopment, and also give characteristics of a failed state, in inverted commas, because of the failed service delivery, and yet they contribute so much into the country's GDP. So therefore, this report for me uses, the terms margins and periphery interchangeably, not just only for its geographic position, but also looking at it from its policy position as the Northern Cape, where, it's positioned to be marginalized in the process of policy and planning, and also the socio-economic governance, where it's supposed to have a voice in determining how its economies should be shaped or reshaped. And this obviously for me contributes to the structural fixing of local municipalities in the rural areas and their local communities within the periphery of the South African state. So I looked at the intergovernmental relations in my paper. I looked at the spatial planning, the IPP construction phase, when it comes to its implications on useful infrastructure and its contribution towards revenue generation and local economic development, and also the way in which these communities relate with the IPPs in the afterlife of the construction. And these are some of the things which are found to be very interesting, where I have to draw parallels with your research paper. So in South Africa, in the context of introducing renewable energy, and when you look at it from an intergovernmental relations perspective, because you spoke a lot about the way in which the national government and the federal government advance the development of renewable energies, particularly if you look at the Bredenberg municipality, local municipalities in Bredenberg that you spoke about. In South Africa, it's always shaped within the context of being sold to the host communities on the grounds that they will benefit from the local economy. It will boost job creation, and also raise local revenues. And obviously these municipalities, because they're dealing with high unemployment rates, and they're struggling to build their own economies and revenue base, they accept these projects without questioning them, unlike in your paper where you actually have the local municipalities in Bredenberg really questioning the ultimate beneficiation of these projects and the kind of rural landscape they change in those municipalities. So for us, it's seen as a panacea for local economic development. But yet again, the planning is not so different from your country, because when you look at the way in which a state economic planning is done in South Africa, particularly in the REIPP program, it's very centralized. It's done by national government. We have departments such as the trade and industry. We have departments, internal departments in the presidency, such as the investment and infrastructure office. And we also have the PICC, the Presidential Infrastructure Coordinating Committee, which actually takes decisions around these projects, and reinforced by the Department of Public Works, because that's the one that's taking the responsibility of infrastructure development in South Africa. And local government is only represented in structures such as the South African Local Government Association, and the Department of Cooperative Governance and Traditional Affairs. So they have a seat in the PICC, but unfortunately, through these processes, the voice of local government doesn't really come out quite vehemently as it's supposed to come when it comes to representing their interests and also voicing their concerns about these projects, especially when it comes to rural municipalities who have to host these kinds of projects and may bring in socioeconomic development issues at a later stage. So when I actually looked at your paper, looking at your findings were very similar to mine. I mean, you place out issues that are related, to the uneven, power relations when it comes to the way in which labor and the way in which the value chain of the renewable energy sector is set out. In South Africa, we've also had similar kinds of problems as well. But beyond and above that, these rural hinterlands, if you would like to call them in South Africa, they attract a population boom because people are looking for new jobs, and they come into these small towns which do not have the infrastructure that could actually cater, for the higher population and the demand for services. So you find that it puts a lot of pressure in that infrastructure, particularly water, sewage, and roads. During the construction phase, you'll find that there's quite a whole lot of heavy material and traffic that moves into these settings. And they have to use the national roads and also the municipal roads, carrying these huge wind turbines and the construction material, and they leave these roads in a very dilapidated state. And also this comes with a whole lot of eruption again on other settlements, like informal settlements, because municipalities aren't able, to properly plan for the housing development in this municipality during this construction phase. And there you have quite a lot of mushrooming of informal settlements. There will be fly-by-night landlords who will be, responding to the speculative property markets, increasing residential prices. So, there is this boom that happens in the municipality, but the municipalities aren't able to cope with providing the necessary infrastructure that is needed to accommodate the population increase. And also what I found interesting in your papers, because you also talk about spatial planning as well. Now, in the case of South Africa, the experiences with that from Mthanjeni was that it's a small municipality, it doesn't have a town planner, and it was unable, to lock in that spatial development framework that would talk to the developments that would be coming with the IPPs. For example, the municipality was not able to use the spatial planning and land use management framework, or should I say policy framework, to rezone these agricultural lands that were going to now become hosts of wind turbines and also solar parks. And therefore they were not able to, to put in the kind of costing that will come with the bulk services that would be needed for these kinds of developments, and also getting a tax and a rates calculation embedded in that, so that the municipality could actually charge for those services and contribute towards their revenue. Instead, most of these IPPs dealt with the private land farm owners, and they agreed on leasing terms and conditions, and they are paying quite a huge number of South African rands per month, up to 1 million rand on leasing, but yet the farms refuse to have their properties rezoned for the industrial and commercial activities that are happening, because it's no longer an agricultural land space, it's now an IPP, it's a special economic zone, and therefore new tariff and taxes need to be imposed. So the municipality ended up litigating against the IPPs because of their refusal of cooperating with the rezoning, of which it's something that I think should have been done a long time ago. But again, like I'm saying, smaller municipalities don't have the capacity. They were introduced into an economy that they were not familiar with, and they didn't know how to move about in setting SEZ tariffs. And also the conflict when it comes to labor. Again, in your paper, you speak about, specialists who are coming from outside. You're speaking about contractors who are coming from outside of Bredenberg. In Mthanjeni, that was the same kind of experience, because the local contractors did not have the financial capacity to bid for participating in the IPP. So most of them were coming from outside, and also the labor force was also coming from outside, because some of the contractors were actually coming with their labor with respect to the kind of projects that they've been doing around the country. And this also created quite a lot of conflict in the community, because it also led to capital outflows as well, where the profits from the construction couldn't be kept in the locality. It was actually going outside of the country, and also to other areas, cities such as Cape Town and Johannesburg, where the IPP offices are. And, when you look at the kind of beneficiation that ought to happen in the long run, these IPPs decided to set up community trusts and contribute towards the social economic development plans, so that they would have some sort of local beneficiation that would happen in the locality, but only to find that because there were certain loans that were taken from banks and the IDC, they had a loan repayment agreement of anything between 6 to 10 years. And only then, once they start making profits, they would now take a percentage of those profits and put back into the community trusts. So communities were complaining that they were actually not seeing the beneficiation because of that long-term repayment loan that they had to stick with their finances, and only getting to see the benefits at a later stage So they were waiting for a period of up to 10 years to start seeing the beneficiation. But when it comes to social, development programs, they found that there was quite a repetition of these investments into social development projects, such as, your early childhood development, your health sector, etc. And most of them were repetitive because the IPPs were not working together with the municipalities to plan appropriately to see what other areas they could invest in besides repetitively investing in the same areas. But then what's mostly critical for me out of this is the issue of tax, like how you actually spoke about in your paper that, in the long run, local host municipalities such as Bredenberg, even in Mtangeni, they were continuing to experience, a higher a higher electricity tariff in the long run. And these communities were not actually seeing how these IPPs were going to contribute towards alleviating that energy poverty and burden onto themselves. And with the municipality, what's even worse in South Africa is that they were not even getting the proper revenue. They had assumed that the IPP sector would sustain the revenue generation and income over the long run. And yet the municipality only found that at the end of the project, more and more debts will be incurred, particularly the Eskom debt, because communities were left poor, they weren't unable to afford electricity, and most of these communities were starting to connect into the grid illegally, and the municipality was losing quite a lot of revenue from electricity. So in this case, I found it very interesting that these are some of the experiences that South Africa had, which really relate quite closely with your experiences. But one thing that was also quite interesting from your paper was that at least the communities in Bredenberg were beginning to resist against the IPP sector. The mayors that you have spoken to, which you relate their sentiments in your paper, were actually starting to resist even the planning processes as well. And I guess it's that form of resistance, most probably, which has really created the kind of conflict that has pushed Germany to say that, you know what, maybe this program is not working for us. Generating revenue from rural municipalities is not working because there's so much resistance that is coming, from the bottom. But in South Africa, there's very little room and leverage for municipalities to really bring in that resistance because of this top-down approach and dependency on the economic development path trajectory of these rural municipalities. And maybe, some of the ideas that have been brought through your government, where municipalities are actually demanding that the IPPs should actually pay directly their tax contributions to the municipalities, is one area that has not yet been explored in South Africa, most probably because of the way in which our policy framework has been structured by DMRE, which makes it difficult for municipalities to do that. And their only form of getting some form of income is through their local tax base for services charged, and also the levies as well, of which municipalities are not really using that towards their advantage. So in South Africa, this is the kind of state that had been imagined through the IRP program for rural municipalities. But if you look at these utterances that had been put by the provincial government in the Northern Cape, 12 years later, this is not the kind of picture that we see in the IPP host communities and host municipalities. In fact, with the green hydrogen that is being planned, as you and I have been talking about it because we seem to be doing similar type of research, maybe these are the things that we should be asking about, the outcomes of the green economy and what kind of, marginal structural fixing of municipalities, especially rural municipalities, it would bring in the case of South Africa. And maybe the last point is that, one thing that we should think about in South Africa is how can rural municipalities really better position themselves with their socio-economic and fiscal and infrastructure interests in the upcoming green hydrogen development in the Northern Cape, because there is a likelihood that there will be a repetition of what we have seen in the past with the IPP sector. So maybe these are the kinds of conversations that both our countries from a local government perspective should be having, rather than just only looking at the bigger just transition and green economy investments that should be carried out in Africa. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Thina. That was also extremely interesting and really highlights some of the important issues. I think what really struck me about both of the presentations is the critical importance of having solutions that reflect local conditions and that are context specific, as opposed to simply some top-down imposition of national policy in an area, and about alignment of incentives and interests. I think what we'll do is let's take some questions now. Please post your questions in the Q&A box, not in the chat. I think I'd like to start with a question. Benedikt, I think what you highlighted in your presentation was not just the issue of sort of national policy simply assuming that there'd be an alignment of interest, but this real unhappiness in the local community in terms of what they had to pay for electricity, and in terms of the grid levies and pricing, but then also about the other issues about having wooden turbines very close to homes, and I know that they can be quite intrusive. Do you think it would have made, it's perhaps a slightly unfair question, but do you think that if there'd been something that had made the electricity cheaper in these areas, for example, that there was a direct benefit, that would actually have made a difference? And I'm asking that because that relates also to Thina's question, where in fact, for the local communities there, the ability to access affordable electricity could actually have been something that really changed perceptions, more important than other things. And the access to cheaper electricity because of investment in electrical infrastructure seems sometimes to be the logical way for local communities to benefit. So, I mean, how important do you think that would have been in changing people's perceptions of these projects?
Yeah, so thank you for this question. I would argue that there's different degrees and different reasons for resisting renewable energy developments. There is certainly a fraction of the population in Germany that is opposing wind turbines, not necessarily for what we might call a rational reason, but rather for identity politic reasons. For example, they're just opposing wind turbines as a renewable energy technology in general. And I think this share of the population, which I would estimate at maybe 5%, I don't think you will convince them with electricity tariffs or any of that sort of argument. But then there's another part of the population that is protesting against renewable energy sources, and they point to these, I think, very reasonable aspects and disadvantages that come with renewable energy sources in rural areas, such as higher tariffs and so on. And I think that's an area where, and that's also backed up by research, when you implement, for example, cheaper tariffs in rural areas, then support for renewable energy sources tends to increase, and it tends to increase to a level where these conflicts might still exist, but at a level where there is a clear majority for renewable energy developments. So essentially, in short, I would say that if you have an appropriate governance and regulatory framework in place, then support for renewable energy sources is likely to persist.
Thanks, Benedikt. That's very interesting. Thank you. Thina, do you want to add to that?
Well, Tracy, within the context of South Africa, there are many things to think about, because it comes out very clearly that one of the crises that we have in the country is energy and poverty. Access to energy is a big issue, both in metropolitan areas and also rural areas. But then with rural communities, the levels of poverty, the levels of dependency on the social wage, which is currently falling, economic opportunities very limited. Communities are really struggling and battling. And with the higher, electricity tariffs, it doesn't make it any easier for them. So I think for communities in these rural areas, their priority is actually saying that we want, affordable electricity. If we have IPPs, in our backyard, why aren't we benefiting directly from these IPPs in order to lower the costs of energy? So for them, that was one of the major priorities, beyond the ability of actually saying that, we're looking for jobs, etc. But for them was, we want cheaper electricity, and we think that we need to derive benefits out of this, even beyond the socioeconomic contributions that the IPPs are said to be making in those communities. They still are not satisfied with those kinds of contributions. So for them, their priority is access to cheap, cleaner energy. But at the same time, it's also saying that to what extent, are these IPPs contributing towards a sustainable, economic development in the municipality? So, that is one of the main points, and also taking into account that, sadly, unfortunately, these municipalities do not even have the infrastructure yet that can actually support IPPs in feeding into the grid. I mean, the former municipal manager used to say to me that in order for us, to really beef up our electricity generation distribution, it means that we will have to, move from a 12 megawatt to a 16 megawatt electricity distribution facility. But unfortunately, they cannot do that because they still have an Eskom debt, which they have to settle, and Eskom will not allow them to have that infrastructure upgrade. So it becomes like a catch-22 situation for these municipalities. So yeah, it's a bit of a challenge in that sense. But yeah, access to cheaper electricity is what communities are looking for in the rural areas.
If I can just make one last point related to this. I mean, also from an economics perspective, tariffs need to reflect distance from renewable energy sources in the future, because otherwise we will need to overbuild transmission grids. And that just doesn't make sense economically. So also from this purely economic perspective, without taking fairness or spatial justice into account in any sense, tariffs need to reflect distance from renewable energy sources. Otherwise, we will end up building transmission grids, and that's uneconomically and will increase tariffs for everyone in the end.
Yeah, that is a very interesting point, and this issue of how you reconcile the requirement to recover costs and the requirement to invest in infrastructure with equity and access is a critical one everywhere, I think, and particularly in South Africa. Katrina has a question that is specifically for Thina, but Benedikt, if you'd like to jump in as well. What she wants to know is about the issue of rezoning agricultural land for the purposes of constructing for renewables, and the importance of that, and why landowners have been resistant to this.
Yeah, that's a very interesting question. Thank you, Katrina. This question comes on the backdrop of a void when it comes to the way in which land is procured in the IPP program. Firstly, during the process of opening up bid windows for IPPs to contest for procurement. During that process, municipalities are not consulted, because that process is driven by National Treasury. It is driven by the Presidency's office and DMRE, etc. So during that process, municipalities are not consulted in the sense that they need to find out to what extent does a municipality have land on its own, like commonage land, and the extent to which a municipality is surrounded or landlocked by private land, of which most municipalities in the Northern Cape are surrounded by private land. There are some municipalities who do have commonage land, but remember, they need hectares and hectares of land. And statistically speaking, the Northern Cape, 70% of the land is owned by private farmers, and some of this land is land that is not even utilized in this sense. So therefore, it leaves it up to the IPPs to actually go and negotiate with the municipality or private landowners. But in the past, the precedence had been that IPPs would actually go and negotiate with private landowners, because private landowners have also seen an opportunity to profit from this sector. And now the difference is that agricultural land, the rates and taxes, are charged at a different level. For example, in Mthanjeni, they actually indicated that farmers would actually pay, property rates and taxes for 2,500 compared to other commercial entities. Now, it means that they will need to be restructuring in this tax and rate contribution, and also building in the bulk infrastructure, because there's quite a lot of traffic that happens during that time. And obviously, they need to contribute towards the municipal bulk infrastructure when it comes to other services. So they are resistant in the sense that, there isn't a proper policy guideline which actually compels farmers to actually, adhere to rezoning, and they take that as an advantage. And if a municipality does not use that as a form of bylaw to say that before we approve the plans for you to take up on IPPs, we expect the landowner to come in and actually, give us their plans, and then we do the rezoning, and then we set new tariffs altogether. So it's this shift from paying lower tariffs to highest tariffs that have to be set by the special economic zones in particular. And these social economic zones, they differ from one place to the other, because in urban municipalities already there is a standard of practice of industrialized areas where they know exactly what is going to be set when it comes to their contributions. But in agricultural, rural communities, they're not familiar with this type of rezoning, and therefore it's difficult for them to determine and structure those contributions. So therefore that policy void and the institutional capacity puts the municipality at a very vulnerable stage. I mean, right now I'm even thinking about the project that we are doing in Rochterveld municipality in the Northern Cape, in Namakwa district, where they'll be introducing the green hydrogen. That land that has been earmarked is land that belongs to the Communal Property Association. So therefore, how then, does the municipality and the CPA redetermine, the value of the development, the industrial value of the development, and the contributions that are going to be made towards the municipality? So that resistance, is purely coming from the fact that, the municipality is very vulnerable, because there are no institutional guidelines as to how they should actually be implementing and enforcing the rezoning. And I think that's a lesson to learn, and maybe something that should be built into the IPP development framework, because currently municipalities don't even have an IPP development framework specifically that speaks to the sector that is part of the SEZ.
Thanks, Thina. Benedikt, would you like to say anything about the rezoning of agricultural land?
Yeah, maybe just shortly. I think in Germany, the situation is actually even worse, because the municipalities don't even have the power to rezone land. So agricultural land stays agricultural land, even if renewable energy sources are being developed there. And I mean, the problem with this is that the landowners, because land is such an important production factor in renewable energy systems, are in such a strong negotiation position that they can really realize considerable windfall profits. In Germany, there's currently no regulatory opportunities or governance instruments to skim off these windfall profits. And that's something I think that is really necessary, because otherwise, on the one hand, these historical uneven ownership distributions will reproduce themselves and will even be accelerated. And on the other hand, that will increase the costs of developing renewable energy sources for everyone. So, for example, in Germany, there's research pointing to the fact that landowners could capitalize, I think, up to 20% of the total profits of renewable energies, which is considerable, and then drives the costs of electricity generation for everyone.
And maybe I should actually add on that, Benedikt. In South Africa, they also use the asset, the asset itself that is within the premise of the renewable energy, land space. And one of the problems that municipalities also discovered that they had was that they don't even know how to evaluate the asset of a wind turbine, for example. If you've got 45 wind turbines, how do you determine the value of that asset in order to reach, the valuation of how much they should be contributing towards the rates of the property itself? So did you perhaps have any issues with that in Germany? And maybe you could share how that was determined as well? Because we're also dealing with wind turbines, we're dealing with, solar, PV solars, and the values of those assets. It's very difficult to quantify from a municipality.
So the problem with the planning system in Germany is that basically these higher levels determine where wind turbines will be built. And that puts the landowners in this very strong negotiation position then. In terms of determining the value, you can estimate it by calculating the capacity factors of renewable energy sources, and then basically multiplying it by the subsidies that renewable energy developers can either realize through the Renewable Energy Act in Germany, or through the market prices they can achieve if they participate in electricity trade. But that is difficult, and you need economic models for it, basically, that are context specific and take into account local production factors and so on. And the municipalities usually cannot do this. The landowners try to do this in negotiating their share of land rent, basically, with the developers, and are rather successful in this regard by basically trying to push the land rents to the point where the developer says, okay, at this point we cannot develop anymore, and that's basically then the maximum land rate.
Very interesting.
Thanks very much. There's a question from Gaynor. She's asking about whether there are any international protocols in place to govern renewable energy investments. For example, the principles of governing large-scale land-based investments in Africa, which I assume refer to largely to agricultural projects, whether there's any set of international protocols to govern these investments and large land-based investments in Africa, if either of you are aware of any of those protocols.
I'm not aware of any protocols, but the way these hydrogen projects at least work currently is that they're requiring subsidies, right? And the German subsidy scheme called H2 Global has formulated a range of criteria for the development of renewable energy sources that should produce electricity for hydrogen. And these criteria are similar to the criteria for renewable energy sources in Germany. So, for example, no renewable energy sources should be developed in nature reserves and so on.
Thanks very much. Benedikt, there's a question for you. So what are your thoughts on the German town of Feldheim? And then the second part of that question, or second question, is what are the best case scenarios of how municipalities have worked together to combine renewable energies to make their town energy self-sufficient?
Yeah, thank you for this question. I'm actually not aware of this particular example of Feldheim. It might be a renewable energy community. So there has been a development in Germany where where municipalities have tried to mobilize renewable energy sources as a development model. Some were very successful in this regard, but what is a basic condition for this is that there is a local utility that is able to develop renewable energy sources. And in that case, this utility then obviously realizes a fair share of the profits, which if it pays taxes or is owned by the municipality, can then be used to provide other public services. But since there is not a municipal utility in every municipality, that is not an opportunity for every municipality. And I think, yeah, as I said, having such a utility in place is a condition for this development model to be successful.
Thanks, Benedikt. There's another question for you as well, which is about whether you could tell us if you encountered any examples of local communities accessing finance or capital so that they could get full ownership or significant shareholding in these wind farms and then benefit directly through that ownership.
Yeah, so thank you again. That's a good question. In the beginning of Germany's energy transition, so in the late 90s, early 2000s, the subsidy scheme in Germany was still different. So basically developers could get a feed-in tariff for the energy they produced for up to 20 years, which basically provided a very secure investment case. And under this regulatory framework, a lot of cooperatives actually sprung up, which developed renewable energy sources, such as wind farms, sometimes only one wind turbine even, or a small solar farm, and so on. And so in the first 15 years, maybe until the late 2000s, 2010, around this time, a lot of cooperatives actually developed renewable energy sources in Germany. But then the government decided to change this regulatory framework. And now all the developers need to first sell their electricity on the stock exchange, the electricity stock exchange essentially, and then can only claim subsidies afterwards. And that requires a lot more of market knowledge and so on from the developers, and has also been an incentive in scaling up the size of renewable energy development. So now you see a lot of huge wind parks, huge solar parks that can compete on the stock exchange, essentially. And that has been to the disadvantage of cooperatives because they cannot finance these huge parks anymore. They can maybe finance one wind turbine or 3 wind turbines, but that's the maximum. And so in the last years, cooperatives and these community-owned renewable energy sources are not really being expanded so much anymore.
Thanks, Benedikt. I think that's an interesting comparison. I think that's a very different situation, well, currently to what the market is in South Africa, where by legislation, local municipalities have got the ability to purchase power directly from kind of any kind of independent power producer or to produce it themselves. Plus the legislation also allows them to have relationships with community organizations and residents associations. So certainly it seems as if there's a lot more space. I mean, the question from Brenda was whether there are lessons for growing local ownership in South Africa from Germany, but there's probably lessons from growing local ownership in South Africa for Germany. I think the critical point now is how municipalities are actually funded and how they can access funding. At present, the community ownership model is really restricted to beneficiaries of the IPP development, which is very much restricted by geographic location around that. There's not really been a big incentive. We're talking now about, you know, financial support to households to put up individual renewable energy and solar systems, but there isn't really significant schemes in place to encourage cooperative and community ownership of renewable energy sort of on their own initiative. So they can participate in existing IPPs, but it's very difficult or impossible for communities at the moment to take the initiative to set up their own things. And I think that also has a lot to do with the way in which procurement regulations are set up. So you've kind of got to wait for a tender to be issued for the renewable energy, and then it's very difficult to then set up a community program to take advantage of that. So we also have ways, very different ways, in which community ownership is disincentivized, not so much by the way in which the electricity market works, but the way in which state procurement works also acts as a disincentive to local ownership. So perhaps the summary is that both countries disincentivize community ownership just in different ways. Thina, here's a question for you from Thabo, and that's about the relationship between national government, local municipalities, and IPPs, and how you think that this relationship could be improved so that rural areas can benefit more from such projects.
Okay, thanks, Thabo, for that question. It basically begins from the notion that IPPs are just an entity that is just there to serve this electricity supply for the grid in South Africa, and therefore their relationship is more stronger at national government level because of the procurement program that is being done by national government. And yet IPPs should be developing a much more stronger relationship with local municipalities, because they are the host municipalities. They are the municipalities which actually set the tone when it comes to the way in which the development should be done or constructed. So there is that uneven power relationship where the municipalities are also not able to exercise their authority, especially when it comes to IPPs being part and parcel of the developmental processes. Like, for example, most IPPs don't participate even in the IDP processes. Communities and municipalities always say that they are the ones who have to chase after IPPs. I remember the mayor saying that he had to go to Cape Town to have a meeting with the office of the IPP, one of the IPPs operating in his municipality, because there was some developmental interest that they wanted them to participate in. And it's not the other way around, where the IPP is supposed to participate in the IDP processes and also look at what kind of budget shortfalls the municipality has and how can they circumvent them, and what kind of procurement arrangements could they make in terms of contributing even in the infrastructure development, even if it doesn't have to be money that is given to the municipality, but working with the municipality to meet the municipality halfway. So there isn't a very good and formidable relationship. It's a relationship that is power-based, where IPPs don't even feel that they are accountable to these municipalities and local communities. I guess that's why even when it comes to their development of the project and the construction of the project, it's a system where they know that municipalities are compelled to approve, and there's no way to beat about it. So in this case, I think that this relationship can be improved more if IPPs could see themselves as being part of that community, because they are using the resources of that community or that municipal jurisdiction to set up their entities and also profit, during the process of procuring and supplying energy to the national grid. So in that sense, I think it needs to be a much more bottom-up driven approach. And that approach, there's an opportunity of building that relationship in the early stages of development, where there are negotiations when it comes to the utility of land, and zoning, and also negotiating with the municipality in terms of what kind of contributions they are going to make. But as it stands, the relationship is non-existent. It's just a few IPPs who are really cooperating with municipalities, but the rest of them, yeah, it's a power relation that you know, tends to infantilize local government more than anything. Yeah.
Thanks, Thina. Benedikt, for Diswa, oh, so you typing an answer about whether lower income households get subsidies to mitigate those increased costs because of the grid.
Yeah, I was just typing an answer. Unfortunately, no, there's no subsidies for low-income households yet. And that's also why there's a huge proportion of that part of the population that is resisting or even opposing the energy transition in Germany.
Thanks, Benedikt. Is there anybody else who'd like to ask a question? Okay, not. All right. I think what we can do then is let's wrap this up. I just wanted to thank you, Benedikt, and thank you, Thina. Would each of you like to make some short closing remarks? Benedikt, we'll start with you.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, first of all, for organizing this event. As I said, I'd be happy to engage in further discussions. My research in South Africa has just started, and I think it will really be a task for us researchers and the general public to, now that these energy transitions become more and more internationalized, and that international relations between South Africa and Germany, for example, start to become meaningful in regard to renewable energy and not just fossil fuels, that we get a head around how conflicts in both countries relate to each other, and how resistance, for example, in one country or the other influences developments in South Africa or Germany. And so, yeah, I'd be happy to engage in further discussions with you all, and yeah, look forward to the next talk. Thank you.
Thank you. Thina?
Yeah, no, thanks, Benedikt, for really sharing your case study with us. I really appreciated it. And it also shows that there are greater opportunities where, you know, we look at state development from a local government perspective, where countries can actually learn from each other. I mean, one of the first questions that I asked some of the municipal officials in the municipality that I did research in, Mthanjeni, was that, did you ever do any study tours to other municipalities, particularly municipalities that already have been participating in the IPP sector, municipalities, rural municipalities that have got wind turbines and solar parks, you know, within their territories. And I was quite startled when they said, no, we hadn't had that opportunity. And I think these are some of the things that should have been done for quite a while, especially in the initial phase where the IPP program was introduced in South Africa, in order for us to understand the kind of consequences that local municipalities, especially rural municipalities, will have to deal with when they take up the green economy. And obviously your case study has offered us that opportunity, even though the situation had looked a little bit bleak 10 years ago. But there are more opportunities to learn, and with the kind of project that I've been doing in the green hydrogen, which the publication is set to come out at the end of July. I hope that we will have more engagement so that we can, you know, properly look at the way in which these green economies have got the kind of socio-economic implications for rural host municipalities, and what kind of solutions we can actually come up with, you know, to circumvent some of the unintended consequences. So thank you very much for participating, and I really enjoyed the engagement. Thanks a lot.
Okay, so before you go, someone jumped in with a question. So, I'm assuming this is a question for Thina. He wants to know if IPPs target municipalities where there's a potential of making high revenues compared to any small municipality. I'm assuming that this is a question about, I would assume that they are selecting municipalities based on the returns, whether that's radiation factors or proximity to whatever's, and that this is that actually the location of the IPPs is not at the discretion of the IPPs, but in fact reflects what's in the integrated resource plan and the details of the bid windows. But perhaps you could just clarify exactly how does an IPP end up in one particular municipality rather than another. Oh, Thina has disappeared. So let me just attempt to answer that. I think the short answer, Thabo, is that the location of where the IPPs to date under REIPP, that's been very much regulated by the integrated resource plan and by the bid windows. So the bid windows won't say specifically exactly where a renewable facility is going to be located, but for all intents and purposes, the parameters of that will set the issues about where these things are located. So it's not really an issue, or to date, it has not really been an issue of an IPP saying I'm going to put myself in this municipality or in that municipality. In the future, that will change because what has happened now is that previously municipalities couldn't procure power directly from IPPs. Now they can. Previously, all of the power and all of what Thina has been describing has been going into the national grid. Now what's happening is that IPPs can set up to directly supply municipalities. And there they would obviously be targeting a particular municipality based on the revenue that they can earn. So I hope that answered your question. All right, thanks again to everyone. Thanks to Benedikt and thanks to PARI and for hosting, and to Thina for her responding. And I hope you all enjoy the rest of your day. Thanks. Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.